It's the Christmas season, so what better time to talk about Terminator Zero? Terminator Zero is the latest entry into the Terminator franchise. The show basically follows a soldier from the future named Ico who has to go back in time, much like Kyle Reese in the first Terminator film, and prevent a AI system known as Kokoro from being and potentially allowing Judgment Day to happen at the hands of Skynet. The characters of the show include Malcolm Lee, the creator of Kokoro, his maid Masaki, his oldest son Kenta, the youngest son Hiro, and his daughter Rika, as well as a Terminator from the future. The bulk of the show takes place in 1997, and a small portion of the show takes place in the year 2022, with a few other dates shown throughout the series as well. The premise basically shows this future soldier named Aiko who has to go back in time, and she escapes at the last second in an attempt to stop Judgment Day from happening, much like in the films. Meanwhile, in the year 1997, we see a scientist named Malcolm Lee as he attempts to put his own AI system online known as Kokoro in an attempt to stop Judgment Day from happening. On the day Judgment Day is said to happen, Aiko arrives as well as a Terminator from the future, and both of them try to get to Malcolm Lee, but for much different purposes. One to prevent Judgment Day from happening, and the other to make Judgment Day happen. And I would say the best way I could describe it is a anime version of the first Terminator film, with a little bit of 2 sprinkled in there as far as action eccentricness goes. While all this is happening, we see kids of Malcolm going on their own adventure to try to find this robotic cat. Their maid trying to catch them, and this ultimately leads them to run into the Terminator, and all hell breaks loose. It's up to Aiko to try to protect the kids. With the help of Saki, Malcolm has an existential dilemma that he has to hash out with Kokoro before she agrees to help him take down Skynet, because she thinks that humanity is probably not worthy of such a reward. That's the basic premise of the show. It does get more complex than that, but that's essentially what's going on. I would describe this film basically the original Terminator movie, only with a probably more complex, although not necessarily better plot. So without further ado, let's get into the positives. First and foremost, I'd say the show is very well animated. It is done by computers, but it looks pretty much hand-drawn, kind of like in the old 90s anime. I don't think it was, but you can really tell this show had a budget, and it does impress from episode to episode. Another positive of the show would have to be its gore. There's really a strong level of brutality in the show, and it does lend towards the R-rated nature of those first 2 movies. People are getting their heads crushed, hands smushed, decapitated, shot, stabbed, anything you can imagine. Just human beings are basically just meat sacks in this show, and it's pretty damn awesome. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, and it's one of the most brutal properties in the Terminator series, if not the most brutal, and I really do love it. Another positive I would have to say would be the characters themselves. I really enjoy Malcolm Lee and his existential crisis, and I think once you find out more about the character about 5 or 6 episodes in, he becomes even more interesting. Aiko is a pretty good lead, and I do like her character, although I do wish they kind of gave her a little more of a backstory. I mean, she is a developed character, but she doesn't really have the charisma of, say, like Kyle Reese from the original film. I also really enjoy Malcolm's kids as well, and they get their own little adventure in the show, with the exception of one of them, and I'll get to that when I get to the negatives of the series. Of course, the Terminator himself, who's actually voiced by Timothy Oliphant, is really intimidating. They didn't get the likeness to Arnold Schwarzenegger for this show, but I think that's a good thing. It does help differentiate it from the original film series. Terminator they do use throughout the series, the main one anyway, is intimidating and creepy, and it gets more and more creepy as the episodes go along, and it's really an awesome antagonist for the series. I have to move on to the mixed aspects of the show, and one of those would have to be that even though this is a relatively original take on the Terminator, there's been there, done that throughout the show. This is more so in the first half of the show, and it does improve as the show goes along with more original ideas. The first 4 to 5 episodes, you really know what's kind of going to happen, and you've seen it done before in the other Terminator movies. And that's not every aspect, mind you. They do have some original ideas, such as 1997 having their own AI robots, thanks to Malcolm Lee, and other aspects like that. But there are a lot of samey things, like the Terminator coming from the future to try to stop a protector is very much the first movie. Our heroes showing up via time travel and having to get clothes is also very reminiscent of those films as well. Hell, there's even direct visual nods to the films, such as one scene where a character has to throw Molotov cocktails out a window, very reminiscent of the pipe bomb chase scene from the first Terminator film. I put this part in mixed because it's not a really heavy problem. It's only in like those first few episodes, and then the series really does become its own thing. But it was very noticeable, and while I do enjoy a good throwback, it was a bit much at times. And another mix I would have to say is Kenta, which is Malcolm Lee's oldest son. This kid is a little asshole. At first, you see him kicking around this mechanical cat who's very realistic, and I really hated him from that moment forward. He's also really whiny, and even though he's the oldest, he's the most unreasonable of all the kids. Maybe not the most immature, but definitely the one that's most hard-headed. He's incredibly stubborn and almost gets everybody killed several times, and I just found him to be very unlikable. He does improve some by the end of the series, but I didn't really care for the character, and I wouldn't put it as negative because, like I said, he does improve some, but pretty much unlikable and had me yelling at the TV screen a couple of times, not gonna lie. As for the negatives, for one, I don't really love how the series ends per se. It ends in a way where you don't necessarily need a season 2, but you could have a season 2. And to me, it felt a little anticlimactic. The actual final episode is big and grand, but the final scenes of those episodes is kind of lackluster in its ending, I think. It doesn't lead to the ending that I kind of was expecting, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it also leads to an ending that's a bit abrupt for my liking. Negative I really have is there is some 3D animation thrown in through the show, and it always looks a little bit janky. Not a huge fan of when they mix 3D and 2D animation. It can work, but here I feel it's a little bit overused at times, especially in like the car sequences. The car is usually 3D, and it's the only part of the animation that I don't like. Everything else looks great, but I do have to point out whenever the 3D is on screen, it's pretty noticeable. And my final negative, I would have to say, and this is going to be a spoiler-free review, I do recommend you watching the series yourself, but I will have to say that once the final episode does happen, there's several revelations that are thrown throughout those final 2 episodes, and it gets to be a bit much like, oh, this character is actually this person. This character may or may not be a machine. This character was from the future. This character could also be this character, and there's a whole lot of that in the finale. And some of the twists are nice, but there's so many thrown at you that it's kind of hard to absorb them all and give them all the proper impact that they need from the audience because you have so much thrown at you at one time. Not really major negative, but just something that I noticed. All in all, though, I'm going to have to give Terminator Zero an 8 out of 10. It is damn close to a 9, but I do think it has a few episodes that aren't as interesting as others, and I think that a couple of the characters and a few of the animation points are a bit underwhelming. I still do think this is a great entry into the Terminator series, and even though it's not a movie, I think it's definitely up in the top 4 in the Terminator franchise. Well, that's my review. Sorry for my voice sounding scratchy. I am just now getting over a sickness, but I was able to talk well enough to get you guys this video. If you haven't seen Terminator Zero, I very much do recommend it. If you're a fan of the Terminator, this is not disappoint. And I think they are probably setting up for a season 2, and I would like it, but it has to go in an interesting direction, much like the first season. I wish you all a Merry Christmas. I hope you enjoyed my review. Let me know your favorite Terminator film down below, or just tell me what you thought of the series if you've already seen it. For those of you who don't celebrate Christmas, have a happy holiday season, and peace out.